Welcome back, my friend. The lamps are lit, the wind has quieted, and somewhere in the shadows the Niffler has found something shiny again. But this time, it's not gold. It's a story, and tonight, he's ready to share it with you. So settle in and listen closely. It begins like this.
Hogwarts Castle that winter resembled a vast, wounded beast, holding its breath in anticipation of an inevitable end. The snow, which usually brought with it a joyful anticipation of Christmas, now lay upon the roofs like a heavy, dead blanket, muffling sounds and burying hope beneath a thickness of ice. In the corridors, where once the laughter and thundering of hundreds of children's feet had echoed, there now reigned a tense, ringing silence, broken only by the rhythmic clumping of the boots of patrol squads. Severus Snape sat in the high headmaster's chair, yet he felt neither grandeur nor triumph. This chair, upholstered in dark leather, seemed to him an instrument of torture, a throne of bones, upon which he had been seated, not by merit, but as a warden in a prison. He stared into the flames in the fireplace, but they offered no warmth. The cold in this office was peculiar. It seeped not through the stone walls, but through the very magic of the castle, which resisted the presence of darkness in its heart. It was deep into the night. The clock on the shelf, a curious mechanism of brass and crystal that had once belonged to Dumbledore, ticked away the seconds with a monotony that grated on the nerves. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Each beat was like a drop of poison falling into a cup of patience that was already overflowing. Severus rubbed his temple with long, cold fingers. The headache had become his constant companion, a faithful dog gnawing at his consciousness day and night. This was the price of occlumency. To keep the mind closed 24 hours a day, allowing not a single sincere emotion to leak out, was an exhausting labor, harder than any physical battle. He rose, and his black robes rustled across the floor like the wings of a bat. Approaching the window, Snape looked out at the snow-covered grounds. The moon, full and indifferent, hung over the forbidden forest, turning the trees into silver skeletons. Somewhere out there, in the darkness, roamed creatures who cared nothing for the war of wizards. But here, inside the castle, the war was in every breath. This afternoon, Electo Carrow had once again attempted to introduce new disciplinary measures for first years, who refused to practice the Cruciatus curse on rats. Severus had been forced to spend an hour maneuvering between the role of the Dark Lord's devoted servant and the protector of the school, to convince her that broken students were less useful than frightened, but intact ones. He had saved the children from physical pain, but he could not save them from the terror that had settled in their eyes. This look, a mixture of hatred and fear with which they followed him through the corridors, cut his soul more sharply than the Sectum Sempra curse. "They think you are a monster, Severus," he whispered to himself, his voice drowning in the high vaults of the office. "And perhaps they are right." He returned to the desk. On the polished surface lay a letter from Lucius Malfoy, another report on successes at the ministry, saturated with flattery and hidden fear. Snape pushed it aside with disgust. His attention was fixed on another object. On the edge of the desk, under a glass dome, lay an old, tattered copy of the Tales of Beedle the Bard. The book Dumbledore had left to Hermione Granger. A riddle that he, Snape, had to solve, but the key to which constantly slipped away. Suddenly the silence was broken by a rustle from above. On the wall, in the very darkness near the ceiling, one of the portraits stirred. "Headmaster," came a creaky, arrogant voice. Snape slowly raised his head. It was Phineas Nigellus Black. His painted figure looked as pompous as in life, but now a predatory glint of the hunter shone in his eyes. "I am listening, Phineas," Snape replied, making no attempt to hide the weariness in his voice. "I hope you have a valid reason for interrupting my reflections, and not merely a desire to complain about the quality of the varnish on your frame." "Oh, believe me, Severus, my news is worth your precious time." The portrait smiled maliciously, stroking his painted beard. "I have just returned from my other frame. The one that, unfortunately, is traveling in the pocket of that mudblood Granger." Severus's heart skipped a beat, but his face remained immobile, as if hewn from marble. "And what did you hear?" he asked in an even tone, though every string inside him pulled tight. "They are quarreling. The Potter boy and the girl. It seems the youngest Weasley left them a few weeks ago. They are in despair, but the most important thing is not that." Phineas paused theatrically, savoring the moment of his importance. "They spoke of where they are now." "Where?" Snape barely restrained himself from shouting. "The Forest of Dean," said Phineas. "They have pitched camp in the Forest of Dean." "The Forest of Dean." Snape closed his eyes. A place so distant, and yet so familiar. The forest of his childhood. The forest of her childhood. It seemed almost a cruel joke of the universe that Harry Potter had ended up in that very place. "Thank you, Phineas," said Snape, quickly regaining his composure. "That is useful information. You may be excused." "Useful?" snorted the portrait. "It is a chance to seize them. You must inform the Dark Lord immediately. The boy is there, defenseless, frozen." "I know what I must do," Snape barked, his black eyes flashing with anger. "And I do not require advice from a scrap of canvas whose greatest feat is spying on teenagers. Return to your place and be silent." Phineas, muttering offendedly about disrespect for elders, vanished behind the frame. As soon as he fell silent, Snape turned to another portrait, the largest in the room, hanging directly behind the headmaster's chair. Albus Dumbledore was asleep, or pretending to be. His silver beard rested on his chest, and his half-moon spectacles had slipped down his nose. "Albus," Snape called quietly. "Did you hear?" The old wizard's eyes opened instantly. There was no sleep in them, only a clear, piercing blue that always saw right through Snape. "I heard, Severus." Dumbledore's voice was calm, like the flow of a deep river. "The Forest of Dean. The time has come." "They are alone there." Snape began to pace the office, his footsteps echoing off the walls. "Without the Order's protection. If I know where they are, then the Dark Lord could find out at any moment. Voldemort is not looking for them in forests, Severus. He is looking for the wand," Dumbledore reminded him. "But Harry needs help. He needs the sword." Snape stopped in front of the portrait, clenching his fists until the knuckles turned white. "You want me to take the sword to him? Right now? Disappear from the castle in the middle of the night, when the Carrows patrol every corridor?" "You know there is no other way," said Dumbledore softly. "You must swap the sword. Give them the real one, and leave the copy here. And you must do it so that Harry does not know it is you." "Of course." Snape smiled bitterly. "The boy must not know that he is being saved by the one he hates most in the world. It would ruin his heroic picture of the world." "It is necessary to protect your cover," Dumbledore replied sternly, notes of his former authority ringing in his voice. "And to protect Harry himself. If Voldemort reads his mind, and sees your face there in the moment of help, all will be lost. Snape took a deep breath, quelling the storm inside. He was used to this. Used to being a tool, a shadow, an evil genius in the eyes of others for the sake of a good that no one would appreciate. "Very well," he said briefly. "I will do it. But the sword, he will not accept it from my hands. The Sword of Gryffindor cannot simply be given." Dumbledore's eyes twinkled slyly. "It must be taken. Under conditions of valor and necessity. You must create these conditions, Severus." Snape nodded. He walked to the wall, where, behind a velvet curtain, a niche was hidden. One wave of his wand, a complex movement of the wrist, and the stonework parted. There, in a glass case, shone the Sword of Gryffindor. The rubies on the hilt glittered in the gloom, like frozen drops of blood. The real sword. He took it out. The metal was cold, but it vibrated strangely in his hand, as if recognizing the magic, though Snape was Slytherin to the marrow of his bones. "You will have to create a copy," Dumbledore reminded him. "A perfect copy." "I have already prepared a blank." Snape walked to the safe in his desk and retrieved another sword. It looked identical. The same rubies, the same shape of the blade. It was the masterful work of renegade goblin smiths, which Snape had ordered through intermediaries in Nocturne Alley a month ago, anticipating this moment. But it was just metal, dead, soulless metal without the magic of Godric. "Now for the hardest part," whispered Snape. He placed both swords on the table, side by side, real and fake. He needed to place enchantments on the fake that would deceive not just the eyes, but the magical sense of anyone who took it in their hands. Except, of course, Voldemort himself. He would sense the forgery if he decided to use the sword to destroy a Horcrux. But Voldemort only wanted to hide it in Gringotts. Snape raised his wand. The air around him thickened. He began to whisper spells of ancient, transfiguration magic. Gemino simulacrum. Obscuro veritas. From the tip of his wand stretched thin silvery threads. They entwined the real sword like a spiderweb, reading its aura, its visual essence, and then slowly flowed onto the copy. The air smelled of ozone and hot iron. Snape felt the magic draining his strength. It was not just copying, it was the creation of a magical phantom, the scent of antiquity on new metal. He worked with focus. Like a surgeon, his pale face covered in sweat. Every movement had to be perfect. If Bellatrix Lestrange, who was to take the sword to her vault, suspected even a thing, he was a dead man. Finally, the last silver thread was drawn into the false blade. The sword gleamed dully and fell silent. Now even the most experienced appraiser would not distinguish them visually. Snape leaned heavily on the table, breathing raggedly. "Masterful," praised Dumbledore from the portrait. "Save your flattery for Potter," Snape snapped, hiding the real sword in the bottomless pocket of his robes, casting a feather-light charm upon it. The fake he carelessly threw into the niche behind the portrait. Suddenly, heavy footsteps were heard in the corridor. Snape froze. It was not merely the gait of a student who had lost their way. It was the confident, authoritative step of an owner. Someone was approaching the gargoyle. He instantly waved his wand, clearing the traces of the magical ritual from the desk. His face became an impenetrable mask once more. There was no knock at the door. It simply opened with a loud crash. On the threshold stood Alecto Carrow. Alecto looked as though she had just crawled out of a lair. Her squat figure filled the doorway, and her small eyes darted about the office, sniffing out treachery like a hound sniffs out a fox. She lacked the refined, insane charisma of Bellatrix. Alecto was the embodiment of dull, brute force that had been given power it did not deserve. "Headmaster," she rasped, not crossing the threshold, but not retreating either. "You are not yet asleep." "As you can see, Alecto." Snape's voice was quiet and dangerously polite. "The headmaster of the school has duties that do not end with curfew. Unlike some teachers who seem to confuse night patrolling with aimless loitering near my office." Alecto smiled crookedly, baring yellow teeth. She took a step forward, and the firelight fell on her coarse face. "I heard a noise," she said, squinting suspiciously. "A strange hum, as if someone was casting spells. Powerful magic, Severus." "Not the school curriculum." She flared her nostrils, drawing in the air, which still smelled faintly of ozone after the sword ritual. "I was experimenting with a new composition for a potion the Dark Lord demanded by the end of the week." Snape lied without blinking. He slowly, with the calculated grace of a predator, walked around the desk and stood between Alecto and the niche where the fake sword now lay. "Or do you wish to question my methods of fulfilling our master's orders?" The mention of Voldemort made Alecto shudder, but her suspicion did not vanish completely. She was dull, but she had a beast's instinct for lies. "A potion," she drawled, looking over the empty desk. "And where are the cauldrons? Where are the ingredients?" "Cleared away." Snape cut her off. "I like order, something which you, Alecto, catastrophically lack. Your brother once again left first-year Slytherins unsupervised in the dungeons. I was informed that they tried to set fire to a tapestry. It was a distraction, and it worked." Alecto's eyes widened with rage, directed no longer at him. "Amicus is an idiot," she hissed. "I told him to watch the little ones. Then perhaps you should go and correct your brother's mistakes, instead of wasting my time." Snape raised an eyebrow, and in this gesture was so much contempt that Alecto involuntarily took a step back. But she still hesitated. Her gaze slid over Snape again, stopping on the pocket of his robes where the shrunk and concealed real sword lay. Snape felt her primitive, crude legitimacy trying to touch his mind. It was as if someone were trying to pick a lock with a dirty stick. He did not put up a block. Instead, he allowed her to see the surface layer of his thoughts: irritation, fatigue, an image of contempt for her and her brother, and a picture of him brewing a complex, boiling poison. Alecto grimaced, recoiling from the mental blow of his disgust. "Fine," she grunted. "I will go. But the Dark Lord will know if you are hiding something, Snape. He sees everything." "Precisely so," Severus said quietly. "He sees everything, including your incompetence." She turned and left, slamming the door so hard that the portraits on the walls shushed indignantly. Snape stood motionless for another minute, listening as her footsteps faded. Only when silence fully returned did he allow himself to exhale. His back was wet with cold sweat. It had been too close. Alecto was a fool, but a dangerous fool. If she reported the strange hum to someone smarter, like Bellatrix, the questions would be more serious. He had no time. He had to act immediately. Snape went to the ingredients cupboard. He needed to prepare for the journey. It was not a simple stroll to Hogsmeade. The Forest of Dean was hundreds of miles away, and although apparitions solved the question of distance, it did not solve the question of survival in a winter forest and penetrating protective enchantments. He took a small leather bag from the shelf and cast an undetectable extension charm on it. Into it flew phials, essence of dittany, in case of injury, a strengthening solution, he had not slept for 2 days, and a phial of silvery liquid, his own memories, which he sometimes extracted to clear his mind before dangerous missions. But today he kept them with him. He needed these memories. Especially one. "Are you ready?" asked Dumbledore. Snape threw a warm traveling cloak of heavy wool over his shoulders. He fastened the silver clasp at his throat and checked that his wand was securely fixed in his sleeve. "As much as is possible," he replied. "I will return by dawn. If the Carrows come again, I will ensure the gargoyle does not let them pass," Dumbledore assured him. "I will say you have fallen into a deep magical sleep after your experiments. They will not dare to wake you, knowing your temper in the morning." Snape smiled faintly at the corner of his mouth. It was true. His morning wrath was legendary among students and colleagues. He walked to the window. To apparate from the Hogwarts grounds was impossible, even for the headmaster, without lifting the protective barriers, which would attract the Ministry's attention. He needed to go beyond the boundaries of the anti-apparition shield. "Good luck, Severus," said Dumbledore quietly. "Remember, the sword must find its way to them, but not you." Snape did not reply. He dissolved into the darkness, transforming into a black shadow that glided down the stairs. He needed to pass through the castle, full of ghosts of the past and enemies of the present, to emerge into the cold night where the hardest test of his life awaited him. A meeting with the boy who had the eyes of the woman he loved, and to whom he had to give the weapon for his own destruction. He descended the spiral staircase, and every step echoed in his head. Lily, the name he had not spoken aloud for years now, sounded in the rhythm of his heart. He was doing this for her, only for her. Stepping into the entrance hall, he felt the air change. It became thick and icy. Dementors. Voldemort had insisted they patrol the perimeter of the walls outside, but their chill penetrated through the stone. Snape stopped before the huge oak doors. He felt joy draining out of him, replaced by his worst memories. His mother's screams, James Potter's laughter, Lily's dead body on the nursery floor. He gritted his teeth and raised his occlumency shield, turning his mind into a smooth steel wall. Dementors could not feed on one who had himself become a void. He pushed the doors and stepped into the snowstorm. The wind struck him in the face like a slap from an icy palm. The blizzard had intensified, turning the world into a chaos of white and black. Snape wrapped his cloak tighter and headed for the gates, forging a path through the drifts. The snow crunched underfoot, a sound that seemed too loud in the night silence. He walked down the drive, flanked by statues of winged boars. Their eyes seemed to watch him. Snape knew that his every movement now could be spotted. If someone looked out from the window of Gryffindor Tower. But the windows were dark. The students slept, dreaming of home and holidays, unaware that their hated headmaster was currently fighting his way through a blizzard to save their chosen one. Near the gates, he felt the presence of the Dementors more strongly. They hung over the archway like tatters of torn night. Snape felt nausea rising in his chest. His hand instinctively reached for his wand, wanting to cast a Patronus, to scatter this gloom with silver light. No, he ordered himself, must not. The Patronus would betray him. The Silver Doe was too personal, too recognizable a symbol. If the Dementors saw it and reported to the Dark Lord, he had to pass them using only the strength of his will. Snape straightened, arranged his face into an expression of cold arrogance, and walked straight at them. "Get out of the way," he spoke in a voice that held no fear, only authoritative command. The Dementors hesitated. They sensed the darkness in him, the mark on his arm, the murder of Dumbledore on his soul. To them, he was one of their own, a creature marked by death. And at the same time, they sensed a power in him that they feared. Slowly, reluctantly, the hooded figures parted, letting him pass. The cold was such that it took Snape's breath away, and frost covered his eyelashes. He walked through them without quickening his pace, though every cell in his body screamed, "Run!" Finding himself beyond the gates, he walked a few more meters until he felt the magical pressure of the anti-apparition barrier vanish. He was free. Snape stopped and looked back at the castle. Hogwarts towered in the darkness, only a few stray lights flickering in the tower windows. It looked lonely and abandoned. Snape felt a strange pang of regret. He had hated this place for most of his life, but it was his home. The only home he had. And now he was leaving it, not knowing if he would return. He focused on the image of the Forest of Dean, on the smell of moss, the sound of the River Wye, the shadows of ancient oaks. "Apparat," he whispered. The world compressed into a tight tube, the air was squeezed from his lungs, and the snow-covered hills of Scotland vanished in the swirl of magical displacement. When he opened his eyes, the silence had changed. It was a different silence, not the dead silence of a stone castle, but the living, breathing silence of a primeval forest. He stood in the middle of a clearing surrounded by age-old trees. There was less snow here, it lay in patches on the fallen leaves, but the air was just as frosty. The Forest of Dean. Snape took a deep breath of the scent of damp earth and pine needles. He was there, somewhere here, amongst these endless trees, hid 3 teenagers on whom the fate of the world depended, and he, Severus Snape, had come to give them a chance to survive. He touched the pocket where the sword lay. He was ready. But first he had to find them, and do it without becoming prey to his own traps. Ahead stretched the darkness of the forest, thick and impenetrable. Snape took a step into the shadow, and the shadow accepted him as its brother. The hunt had begun. The Forest of Dean did not welcome him as a guest, but as an intruder who dared to disturb the peace of an ancient sanctuary. If Hogwarts was a stone prison where every draught whispered of danger, then this forest was a temple of primeval, wild magic, indifferent to human wars. Here, amongst ancient oaks and gloomy spruces, time flowed differently, slower, heavier, measured not in minutes, but in the depth of the snow cover and the length of the shadows. Severus Snape stood motionless, allowing his senses to tune into the rhythm of the forest. He was a potions master. He knew how to listen to the whisper of ingredients, but here he needed to listen to the silence. A silence that might conceal the most important secret of the wizarding world. He took the first step. The snow crunched underfoot. A sound sharp and dry, like a gunshot in the void of night. Snape instantly cast a silencing charm upon himself. Now he moved like a ghost, a black smudge on the white canvas of winter. The cold crept under his cloak, biting at his skin, but Severus welcomed this chill. It helped keep his mind clear, focusing on the goal, driving away superfluous emotions that tried to break through his occlumency shield. In his pocket, shrunk and concealed by charms, lay the Sword of Gryffindor. Its presence was felt almost physically, like a hot coal pressed against his thigh. Godric's artifact resisted Snape's dark magic, his Slytherin essence. The sword wanted to be found, wanted to serve, but not him. Snape felt this vibration of the metal, a quiet, ringing hum that resonated with the magic of the forest. Patience. He mentally ordered the sword, as if it were a living creature. You will get your hero, but first, I must ensure this hero survives until morning. Phineas Nigellus had given him only a general direction, the Forest of Dean. But these were miles and miles of thickets, ravines, and frozen streams. To find a tent here, protected by the best enchantments Hermione Granger was capable of, was a task bordering on the impossible. Snape knew Granger's talents. She was meticulous, clever, and worst of all, she had learned in his classes. She knew how to cover tracks. He drew his wand, ebony, dragon heartstring, and raised it before him. Revelio Vestigium, he whispered barely audibly. The air before him shimmered. Usually, this spell revealed traces of magical activity, residual dust from apparition, the imprint of levitation charms, the warmth from a recently extinguished fire. But now the forest remained clean, only the faint, natural glow of trees sleeping their winter sleep. Nothing. They were hiding well. Snape moved deeper into the forest, relying on intuition and logic. They would not pitch camp in an open area. They needed water, a river or a spring. They needed protection from the wind, a hollow or a dense spruce grove, and they would have to avoid human paths. He walked for an hour, then a second. The forest grew denser. Tree branches, heavy with snow, bowed to the very ground, creating whimsical arches that resembled entrances to the underworld. The darkness around was so thick, it seemed one could touch it with a hand. Suddenly, Snape stopped. His attention was caught not by what he saw, but by what he did not hear. To his left, somewhere half a mile away, an owl had fallen silent. In the forest, birds do not fall silent without reason. They are frightened by a predator or a human. Snape dissolved into the shadow of an old oak, becoming part of the bark. He waited. A few minutes later, the wind brought a scent. Faint, almost elusive, but to Snape's experienced nose, it was obvious. The smell of cheap tobacco, unwashed bodies, and roasted meat. And another smell, the sickly sweet, rotten scent of dark magic, used not by masters, but by self-taught executioners. Snatchers. Snape's heart beat faster, not from fear, but from cold fury. The refuse of the magical world, marauders to whom Voldemort had given the power to hunt the undesirables. If they were here, it meant they too had sensed something, or were simply combing the forest at random. If they found Potter before him, Snape moved towards the scent. His movements became even more fluid, even more cautious. He did not run. He flowed between the trees like black water. Soon he saw the glint of a fire. In a small clearing, protected from the wind by a rocky outcrop, a group of 5 men had settled. They sat around the fire, roasting some birds on sticks and laughing loudly, passing a bottle around the circle. Snape approached, hiding behind a thick bush. He recognized one of them, Scabior, a former Slytherin, expelled from school for attempting to curse a caretaker. Now he wore motley clothes, likely stripped from victims, and behaved like the king of this forest. "I'm telling you," one of the snatchers spoke hoarsely, jabbing a gnawed bone towards the darkness. "I heard something. Over there, by the river. Like someone walking." "It was a deer, you fool!" Scabior waved him off, taking a large swig from the bottle. "Or a boar. There's no one here. We combed the northern quadrant, empty." "And I say there was magic," the first insisted. "I have a nose for mudbloods. They stink of fear." Snape narrowed his eyes. If this snatcher had truly sensed something by the river, it could mean Potter was somewhere there, and that Granger's protective charms, perfect as they might be, could have weak points, or the snatchers possessed artifacts for searching. He could not allow them to test this guess, but neither could he simply walk out and order them to leave. Severus Snape, headmaster of Hogwarts, right hand of the Dark Lord, would have no reason to protect fugitives in a forest. If he revealed himself, it would raise suspicions that would reach Voldemort faster than he could return to the castle. He needed to act differently. Subtler. Crueler. He raised his wand but did not aim it at the Snatchers. He aimed it at the forest around them. He recalled a spell he had found in an old book in the Malfoy library, an illusion that affected primal instincts. Timor umbrarum. Fear of shadows. Snape made a complex movement with his wand, and the forest around the Snatchers' camp began to change. For them, first, the wind died down. The flames of the fire, which had been crackling cheerfully, suddenly dimmed and changed color from orange to a sickly green. Shadows from the trees elongated, stretching towards the men like clawed paws. What in the hell? Scabior grabbed his wand, looking around. Who's there? I told you, squealed the one who had heard footsteps. It's them, or something worse. Snape increased the pressure of the magic. He made dry branches crackle around the camp, creating the illusion that they were surrounded by a vast number of creatures. From the darkness came a low, guttural growl, a sound no ordinary animal could make. It was a sound woven from nightmares. Is it werewolves? Whispered one of the youngest Snatchers, his face turning white. Is it the full moon tonight? No, you idiot, 2 more days, barked Scabior, but fear cut through his voice too. Lumos. The beam of light from his wand picked out only snow and trees from the darkness, but Snape made the shadows dance on the edge of the light, forming into indistinct, menacing silhouettes. Ait, whispered Snape, imbuing the word with a will capable of crushing stone. Run. It was not a vocal message. It was a thought implanted in their heads, a sensation of animal terror, panic, a desire to be anywhere but here. To hell with this place. The first Snatcher could not stand it. I'm not going to be dinner for some monster. He grabbed his things and bolted in the direction opposite the river. Stop, coward, shouted Scabior. But when the growling became louder and closer, and 2 red eyes, a simple illusion created by Snape, looked at him from the darkness, his nerves gave way too. We're leaving, he commanded, trying to preserve the remnants of his dignity. Bad spot. Cursed. We'll check the southern slope. They ran, stumbling, abandoning their uneaten dinner and bottles. Snape stood in the shadow, lowering his wand, and watched them go, his lips curled in a contemptuous sneer. Pathetic. They called themselves hunters, yet they fled from their own shadow. When the thumping of their feet faded, Snape extinguished the fire with a wave of his hand, destroying traces of their presence. The forest plunged back into darkness and silence. But now he had a clue. By the river, he turned west, towards where the sound of water grew louder. Now he moved even more cautiously. The Snatchers were a blunt instrument, but Harry, Ron, and Hermione were cornered beasts, and a cornered beast attacks anything that moves. He could not allow them to spot him. It would ruin everything. Severus Snape became a shadow once more, continuing his journey through the white silence, bearing the burden of the sword and the burden of his promise. The River Wye was a black artery cutting through the snowy body of the forest. The water within it had not frozen completely. The current was too swift, and the sound of water breaking against stones masked Snape's footsteps. He walked along the bank, peering intently at the opposite slope. There, amongst a dense wall of spruces, was the perfect place for a camp. Suddenly, he felt it, a barely perceptible magical resistance, as if the air had become thicker, as if an invisible cobweb had touched his face. Protective charms. He stopped, holding his breath. They were here. Hermione Granger had outdone herself. Snape, an experienced wizard, a master of the dark arts, stood 10 meters from their hiding place and could barely distinguish it. Muggle-repelling charms, cave inimicum, protego totalum. It was a complex, multi-layered defense. Had he been an ordinary passerby, he would have suddenly wanted to remember an iron left on at home, or simply walk in the other direction. But he knew what he was looking for. Snape slowly raised a hand, not touching the barrier. He probed its structure, rigid, tense magic. The charms had been cast by a weary hand, but with a desperation that gave them strength. He could not pass through them. Any attempt to break the protection would alert the inhabitants of the tent. He had only one option left: to wait, to become the Watchful Eye. He found a convenient spot on the slope, slightly above their camp, hidden behind the fallen trunk of an old beech. From here he had a view of the small clearing which the protective dome concealed from the rest of the world. For him, thanks to his magical sight and knowledge of spell structure, the air above the clearing merely shimmered slightly, allowing him to see what was happening inside. There stood an old, shabby tent. Snape remembered it. He had seen it once at the Quidditch World Cup in other people's memories. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney. An hour passed. Snape did not move. Snow began to dust his shoulders, turning him into part of the landscape. The cold penetrated his bones, but he ignored it, immersed in a meditative state of waiting. The tent flap pushed aside. Snape tensed. A figure emerged. It was Harry Potter. Severus felt a wave of complex, bitter emotion rise in his chest. The boy looked terrible. He had lost weight. His clothes hung on him in rags. His face was overgrown with stubble. He looked not like the chosen one, not like a hero from posters, but like a child lost in a war of adults. But the eyes, even from such a distance, even in the dark, Snape saw that gaze. He constantly scanned the forest, nervously gripping his wand. Lily's eyes. Something glittered on Potter's neck. A gold chain. A locket. Snape realized what it was. A Horcrux. "You wear it on yourself, you fool," thought Snape with a mixture of anger and horror. "You wear a piece of the Dark Lord's soul next to your heart. No wonder you look like a corpse." Potter sat on a stump near the tent entrance, turning his face to the cold wind. He looked so lonely that the sight cut Snape to the quick. Where was Weasley? Where was Granger? A minute later, she came out. Hermione Granger. She carried 2 steaming cups. She said something to Harry, quietly, almost soundlessly. Harry took the cup, but did not smile. They sat side by side, but between them lay a chasm of silence and grief. Weasley was not there. They have quarreled, Snape realized. The Golden Trio has fractured. The Horcrux has done its work. This complicated everything. Without Ron, without his emotional support, primitive as it might be, Potter became unstable. He could make a mistake. He could give up. Snape looked at them, and other images floated in his memory. Lily sitting on the grass near the castle, laughing at a joke. Lily crying after a fight with her sister. Lily defending him, Snape, from the marauders. This boy sitting there was the living embodiment of her sacrifice. And at the same time, he was the son of James Potter. This dichotomy had torn Snape apart all his life. He wanted to protect him, and he wanted to shake him, to shout at him for his negligence, for allowing himself to sink so low. "You must be strong," Snape whispered in his mind. "You must survive, otherwise it was all for nothing." Harry finished his tea and stood up. He began to walk the perimeter of the barrier, checking the charms. His movements were jerky, nervous. He was on the edge. Snape realized he could not simply toss the sword under the tent. If Harry found it just like that, he would suspect a trap. He would think it was a cursed object planted by Voldemort. Or, worse, he wouldn't understand how to use it. The sword must be earned, Dumbledore had said. Under conditions of valor, Potter had to prove himself. He had to overcome an obstacle to obtain the sword. Only then would the sword's magic accept him. And only then would Harry believe it was a true gift, not a trap. Snape's gaze fell upon a frozen pool located a little further into the forest, 100 yards or so from the camp. The ice there was thick, black as a mirror of the abyss. The idea formed instantly. Cruel, risky, but the only right one. He would place the sword at the bottom, under the ice. It would force Potter to act. It would force him to submerge himself in icy water, a symbolic cleansing, a test of spirit. And water. Water blocks the effect of many dark curses, if there were such on the Horcrux. Snape guessed the locket offered resistance. But how to lead him there? Harry would not follow an unknown voice. He would not follow a sign on a tree. He would follow light, something pure, that evoked no fear. He would follow a Patronus. Snape felt his heart beat faster. To cast a Patronus here, so close to them. It was a huge risk. If Harry saw the doe, might he recognize her? No, he never knew of Snape's Patronus. Lily. Had Harry seen his mother's Patronus, perhaps in photographs? No, Patronuses change, and they are rarely documented. But the doe was a symbol of Lily. If Harry saw her, he would feel that connection. He would follow her because his heart would tell him to. It was perfect, and it was unbearably painful. Potter and Granger returned to the tent. The light inside went out. They lay down to sleep, relying on their charms. Snape remained at his post. He became the guardian of their sleep, the Watchful Eye. He waited until the night was at its darkest, until the forest sank into that peculiar state of pre-dawn torpor, when even the wind falls silent. He needed to set the stage. Quiet as a shadow, he descended from his observation point. He circled the camp wide to avoid disturbing Granger's tripwires. He approached the frozen pool. The ice was solid. Snape stepped onto it, and the surface did not even crack. He retrieved the real Sword of Gryffindor from his pocket. He removed the shrinking charms. The artifact lay in his palm, heavy, majestic. The rubies glinted dully in the starlight. "Your time has come," whispered Snape. He could not simply break the ice with a spell. It would be too loud. He used a severing charm, Defendo, drawing a perfect circle on the ice. Then he carefully removed the block of ice and set it aside. Black water steamed in the frost. Snape lowered the sword into the water. He watched as the silver blade slowly sank into the darkness until it came to rest on the stony bottom. The water above it was clear, and the sword shone from below like a treasure from the legends of King Arthur. Perfect. Now remained the hardest part. Waiting. He returned to the cover of the trees. He could not cast the Patronus while Harry slept. Potter had to be on watch. Only then would he notice the light. Snape waited an hour. 2. His body was stiff with cold, but he held on by sheer willpower alone. He remembered warmth. Not the fire of a hearth, but warmth of a different kind. The warmth of Lily's hand when they first rode the Hogwarts Express. The warmth of her smile when he gave her the enchanted lily. The warmth he had lost forever, but which continued to burn within him like an eternal flame feeding his Patronus. Finally, the tent flap stirred again. Harry came out. It was his turn to keep watch. He looked even more exhausted than in the evening. He sat near the entrance, rubbing his hands, trying to keep warm. He stared into the darkness of the forest, and in his gaze was despair. He did not know what to do next. He had lost hope. "Look," Snape mentally commanded him. "Look, and do not be afraid." Snape closed his eyes. He shut out the cold, the war, his own self-loathing. He immersed himself in his most secret memory. He did not allow himself to think of Lily's death, that tainted the magic with pain. He thought of her life, of her light, of the fact that she lived on in this boy. Love, pure, unrequited, eternal love, the only thing within him that remained bright. Expecto Patronum, he exhaled. From the tip of his wand burst not just a beam, but a stream of silver light. It was not blinding, it was soft, like moonlight. The light condensed, took shape. 4 legs, a graceful neck, a proud head. The Silver Doe stepped onto the snow. She was beautiful. She glowed from within, illuminating the tree trunks around with a ghostly radiance. She turned her head to Snape, and her eyes, woven of light, looked at him with understanding. "Lead him," ordered Snape without words. The doe nodded, and soundlessly stepped forward. She passed through the trees, leaving no tracks, and emerged at the edge of Harry Potter's vision. Snape watched from the darkness. He saw Harry raise his head, saw his eyes widen in wonder, saw him grab his wand but not attack. He was mesmerized. The doe stopped, looked back at the boy, inviting him to follow. Harry stood up. He took a step, then another. He followed her. "Go," whispered Snape, and a tear rolled down his cheek, freezing instantly. "Follow her. She will lead you to salvation." Harry walked away from the tent, breaking safety rules, forgetting everything in the world. He followed the silver ghost of his mother, not knowing that this ghost was summoned by the man he considered a murderer. Snape followed, keeping his distance, hiding in the deepest shadows. He had to ensure Harry made it, that he found the sword, and that he did not die trying to retrieve it. The Watchful Eye continued its vigil. The hunt had entered its final phase. But now the prey was not Potter. The prey was victory over the Dark Lord, and this sword was the key to it. The Forest of Dean, witness to many secrets, now held one more. The secret of the Silver Doe and the Black Shadow walking side by side through the winter night. The Silver Doe glided between the trees, her hooves not touching the snow, woven of moonlight and the purest magic of which Severus Snape's soul was capable. She was a beacon in the boundless darkness of the Forest of Dean, a guide through a night that seemed to have swallowed the world whole. Snape watched her from a safe distance, concealing himself in the deep shadows of the centenary oaks. He saw Harry Potter following, stumbling over roots hidden beneath the snow, breathing heavily, mesmerized by the apparition. In this moment, there was nothing heroic about the boy. He was simply a teenager, frozen, frightened, and desperately lonely. Snape felt a familiar pang somewhere beneath his ribs, a mixture of irritation and a strange, sickly pity. How many times had he seen Potter like this? Defenseless, naive, ready to throw himself into the abyss after the first flicker of hope. "Go on, Potter," Snape urged him mentally, gripping his wand in his pocket so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Do not stop, do not doubt, she will not harm you. She is the only thing in this accursed forest that definitely wishes you no ill." The forest around them was alive. Branches creaked under the weight of the snow like old bones, the wind howled in the treetops, creating a disturbing symphony of winter. But around the doe reigned an absolute, sacrosanct silence. Her light drove away not only the darkness, but fear itself. Snape knew what Harry was feeling right now, that warmth, that sense of safety radiated by the Patronus. It was Lily's warmth, even years after her death, even through the prism of Severus's magic, her essence remained unchanged. She offered hope. They emerged into a small clearing, where, amidst a jumble of rocks and fallen trunks, a frozen pool lay black. The doe stopped at the very edge. She turned her graceful head towards Harry, and for a moment it seemed she was looking straight into his soul, and then, as the boy approached, she simply dissolved. She scattered into myriads of silver sparks, which slowly faded in the frosty air, leaving Potter alone with the darkness. Now it all depends on you, thought Snape, freezing behind the broad trunk of a beech tree 20 yards from the pool. He cast a disillusionment charm upon himself of such power, that even if Harry looked straight at him, he would see only a distortion of the air. Harry stood bewildered. He looked around, whispering, "Lumos," lighting his way with his wand. The light picked out the black, mirror-like surface of the ice. Snape saw the boy step closer, saw him squint, peering into the depths. And then Harry saw it. Snape felt the vibration of magic even at a distance. The Sword of Gryffindor, lying on the bottom, responded to the presence of a true Gryffindor. The rubies glowed dully underwater, casting red reflections onto the ice. "It's it!" The wind carried Harry's whisper. Snape tensed. This was the critical moment. If Potter was smarter, more cautious, if he were a Slytherin, he would have tried to summon the sword with an Accio charm. He would have checked the water for traps. He would have called Granger. But this was Potter. Harry began to strip off his clothes. Snape nearly groaned aloud. "Idiot," ran through his head. Noble, reckless idiot. You intend to dive into icy water in the middle of winter, at night, all alone. Has life taught you nothing? But somewhere deeper, beneath the layer of cynicism, Snape felt respect. It was the very quality Godric Gryffindor had possessed. The readiness to act. The willingness to endure pain for a goal. The sword would not yield to one who stood on the bank waving a wand. The sword demanded sacrifice. And Potter, intuitively or out of stupidity, understood this. Harry remained in his underclothes, shivering with cold. His thin body looked pitiful against the backdrop of the forest's stern grandeur. On his neck, on a gold chain, hung the locket of Slytherin. The Horcrux. It looked like a black stain on the boy's pale skin, like a tumor sucking out life. Snape felt the dark magic of the locket stir. The artifact sensed a threat. It sensed the proximity of that which could destroy it. "Take it off," whispered Snape soundlessly. "Take that thing off, before you climb into the water, you fool." But Harry did not take it off. He raised Hermione's wand. No, it was a blackthorn wand he had stolen from someone. Snape recognized it, and pointed it at the ice. "Defendo!" The ice cracked with a loud, dry sound that rolled through the forest like a gunshot. The block of ice flipped over, revealing the black water. Harry took a deep breath that seemed to make his ribs creak, and jumped. The splash of water broke the silence, and the forest froze once more. Snape took a step forward, emerging from the safe shadow of the tree. His eyes were riveted to the hole in the ice. 1 second, 2, 3, the surface of the water calmed. The ripples spread out and vanished. "Come on, Potter. Grab it and get out. It isn't deep." But Harry did not surface. Suddenly the water churned. It was not the movement of a swimmer. It was a struggle. Snape felt a flare of dark magic. so powerful and cold that it pierced to the bone more sharply than the frost. The locket, the Horcrux, had awakened. It realized the end was approaching and decided to defend itself. It did not attack the sword. It attacked the bearer. Snape saw something glint underwater. The gold chain pulled tight, cutting into Harry's neck, cutting off his breath, dragging him down, away from the air, away from life. Snape froze. His heart hammered in his throat. He had Dumbledore's order. Harry must do it himself. But Dumbledore had not said, "Let Harry drown like a kitten while you watch." If he intervened now, he would save Potter's life, but destroy everything else. Harry would see Snape in the forest. He would realize it was Snape who sent the doe. He would realize Snape had the sword. And Voldemort, who had a mental link with the boy, might see it too. It would be the end of the spy. The end of the plan. But underwater, Harry stopped struggling. His movements grew weaker. Air bubbles ceased rising to the surface. Snape thought no longer. Instincts, honed by years of protecting this insufferable boy, took over. "Damn it all," he hissed. He tore from his spot. His black robes billowed behind him. He ran across the snow, ready to dive into that icy water, ready to drag Lily's son from the embrace of death, even if it cost him his life. He had already raised his wand, ready to smash the ice with a blasting curse, when suddenly, on the other bank of the clearing, a light flared. It was not magical light, but a living, warm light from the Deluminator, suddenly released to show the way. Out from between the trees, breaking branches and breathing heavily, ran a figure. Red hair, a face distorted by fear, clothes wet with snow. Ronald Weasley. Snape skidded to a halt, nearly falling on the slippery stones. He instantly retreated back into the deep shadow of a spreading spruce, casting the concealment charms upon himself once more. His heart thumped so hard it seemed the sound could wake the entire forest. Weasley had returned. Of all possible moments, this eternally unlucky, emotionally unstable boy had chosen this very second to appear. He will be too late, thought Snape with horror, looking at the black water which was already almost covered by a thin film of new ice. But Ron did not hesitate. He asked no questions, did not look around. He saw the empty hole in the ice, the pile of Harry's clothes on the bank, and understood everything instantly. With a cry full of despair, he jumped into the water fully clothed. Another splash. Silence again. Snape stood, gripping the tree bark so hard a splinter drove under his fingernail. Time stretched into infinity. Every second they were not on the surface seemed an hour. "Come on, come on," he whispered soundlessly, and in this whisper was a prayer he had never spoken aloud. And then the surface of the water exploded. Two heads broke the surface simultaneously, greedily gasping for air. Harry was coughing, choking on water, his face blue from cold and suffocation. Ron held him with one arm, dragging him to the bank, and in the other hand. In Ronald Weasley's other hand, shone the Sword of Gryffindor. Snape leaned his back against the tree and closed his eyes. The wave of relief was so strong, his legs nearly gave way. He slowly slid down the trunk, crouching in the snow. The adrenaline boiling in his blood began to recede, leaving behind trembling and cold. They were alive. They had the sword, and they had not seen him. It was a miracle, a senseless, chaotic Gryffindor miracle. He heard them climb onto the bank, heard them breathing heavily, heard their teeth chattering from the cold. You came back?" Harry's voice was weak, hoarse. "Yeah," replied Ron, and his voice held so much guilt and relief. You nearly drowned, mate." It's the locket," Harry coughed. "It tried to strangle me." Snape opened his eyes and cautiously peered out from his hiding place. Harry was feverishly dressing, his hands shaking so much he could not fasten the buttons. Ron stood nearby, holding the sword. He looked like an ancient knight lost in time, wet, frozen, but with burning eyes. He returned thanks to the Deluminator, Snape realized. Dumbledore knew. The old manipulator knew Weasley would leave, but he also knew he would want to return. Now remained the last thing. The hardest thing, the destruction of the Horcrux. Snape knew the nature of dark artifacts. The locket would not yield without a fight. It would defend itself not with physical force, but with something worse. It would strike at the most painful places. "You have to do it," said Harry, pointing at the sword in Ron's hand. "Me? No, Harry, it's you. You're the chosen one." "I can't." Harry touched his neck, where a red mark from the chain remained. "This thing. It knows me. It affects me too strongly." "But you pulled the sword out. You passed the test. You came back. You have to do it." Snape nodded to himself. Potter was right. It was the logic of magic. The sword belonged to the one who had shown the valor to retrieve it. Right now, the master of the sword was Ron. They placed the locket on a flat stone. It looked harmless, just a gold ornament with an S of green stones. But Snape saw the black aura pulsing around it. "I'm going to open it," said Harry. He spoke in Parseltongue. Snape heard that eerie hissing sound that sent a chill down the skin, stronger than the winter wind. "Open." The golden lid of the locket clicked and sprang open. And then hell began. It was not an explosion. It was a release of concentrated darkness. From the locket burst a column of black smoke that began to form into images. Snape watched, holding his breath. He knew what occlumency was. He knew how to protect his mind from intrusion. But what the Horcrux was doing was not mind-reading. It was a projection of fears. Two figures emerged from the smoke, tall, beautiful, shining with a distorted evil light. Harry Potter and Hermione Granger. But these were not the weary teenagers from the tent. These were idealized, cruel versions. "Why did you return?" The voice of Riddle Harry was full of contempt. "We were happy without you. You are superfluous. No one needs you." "Who could look at you beside Harry Potter?" sneered Riddle Hermione, winding her arms around the neck of the double. "You are ridiculous, Ronald Weasley. You are mediocrity." Snape felt these words cut his own heart. The Horcrux struck at Ron, but it hit Snape too. "You are superfluous. No one needs you. She never loved you. You were only a shadow of James Potter in her life. You were always second best." Snape saw his own past in this vision. A red-haired girl, Lily, and a popular boy in glasses, James, laughing at him at Snivelus. It was a universal poison, the fear of being unloved. Ron stood, the sword lowered. His shoulders shook. His eyes burned with the red reflection of the Horcrux's eyes. He believed it. He was drowning in this vision, just as Harry had drowned in the water a minute ago. "Ron!" shouted the real Harry, but his voice was drowned in the roar of the wind raised by the Horcrux. "Kill it! Strike! It's a lie!" Snape wanted to cover his ears, close his eyes. It was too personal. too painful. To watch someone's soul being turned inside out. But he could not look away. He had to make sure it ended. Riddle Hermione leaned towards Riddle Harry and kissed him. It was grotesque, demonstrative. Ron screamed. It was the cry of a wounded beast. But instead of fleeing or surrendering, he raised the sword. In that movement was the fury of centuries, all the pain of secondary heroes, of all those who were underestimated, laughed at, left behind. The Sword of Gryffindor described a silver arc in the air. It sliced through the ghostly figures, sliced through the black smoke and descended with a clang upon the gold locket. A terrible shriek rang out, not human, not animal. It was a piece of soul dying. The sound was so high-pitched that Snape felt capillaries burst in his nose. The black smoke thrashed in convulsions and dissipated. A magical shockwave from the blow knocked Harry off his feet and threw Ron back into the snow. And then came silence. Absolute, ringing silence. The wind died down. The trees stopped creaking. Even the cold seemed to retreat. Snape exhaled slowly, feeling the tension leave his body, leaving behind emptiness and fatigue. It was done. One of the anchors holding Voldemort to this world was destroyed. And it was done not by a great wizard, not by a mighty warrior, but by the youngest Weasley son, with trembling hands and a broken heart. Perhaps Dumbledore was right, thought Snape, wiping blood from under his nose with the sleeve of his robe. Love, even as imperfect, jealous and painful as this boy's, is stronger than the darkest magic. He watched Harry crawl over to Ron, saw them sitting in the snow, breathing heavily, saw Harry embrace his friend, awkwardly, in a manly fashion, clapping him on his wet back. "I thought it was true," whispered Ron. "What it showed." "Never," said Harry firmly. "Hermione," she cried, "for weeks after you left. She's like a sister to us, Ron. You know that." Snape felt he had seen enough. It was a moment of intimacy to which he had no right. He was a spy, an enemy, a traitor. He had no place in this circle of friendship. His fate was to stand in the shadows and watch others live the life of which he could only dream. He slowly, very slowly began to retreat. Step by step, without disturbing the snow cover, he moved away from the clearing. His mission was accomplished. The sword delivered. The Horcrux destroyed, Potter alive. But inside him, it was empty. Victory brought no joy, only the realization of how long and dark the path to the end would still be. Snape moved far enough away so that the crack of apparition would not be heard. He lifted the concealment charms. The cold crashed down on him again, with all its weight. His robes were damp with snow, his feet numb. He was exhausted, physically and magically. Casting the Patronus, maintaining complex illusions, the constant tension, it had drained him to the dregs. He looked at the sky. Through the clouds, the pale light of dawn began to break. The sun was rising over a world that did not even suspect it had become a little safer this night. Severus Snape glanced back one last time in the direction of the camp. He could no longer see them, but he knew they were there. "Always," he whispered into the void of the forest. This word was his vow, his curse, and his prayer. He turned on the spot. Darkness swallowed him, and the Forest of Dean was left alone with its secrets, keeping in its memory the tracks of the Silver Doe, the broken ice, and the shadow of the man who gave everything, asking for nothing in return. The return to reality was painful. When the compression of apparition ceased, and Severus's feet touched the hard cobblestones of the alley in Hogsmeade, He barely kept his balance. The world around him lurched, like a ship in a storm. His body, which a minute ago had been sustained by pure adrenaline and magical mobilization, now reminded him of its true state. Every muscle ached from the cold that had penetrated deep beneath the skin, and his lungs burned from the sharp change in air, from the clean, oxygen-rich spirit of the Forest of Dean, to the damp, smoky air of the wizarding village. Hogsmeade was still asleep. The shop windows were dark. Only here and there did the panes reflect the first, shy rays of dawn breaking through heavy leaden clouds. The street was empty, save for a solitary cat darting beneath the sign of the Hog's Head. Severus leaned his shoulder against the cold wall of the nearest building and allowed himself to close his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. Enough. He straightened, jerked his robes into place with a habitual movement, and set off towards the castle. His gait, usually sweeping and swift, was now heavier. He did not walk, he marched, forcing himself to move by willpower alone. The road to Hogwarts seemed endless. The wind here, in the north of Scotland, was different. It lacked that woody forest note. It was a wind of emptiness that roamed over the Black Lake, bringing the smell of stagnant water and rotting reeds. At the gates, they stood again. Dementors. The morning shift. There were more of them now, circling above the entrance like tatters of torn night, refusing to vanish beneath the sun. As Snape approached, he felt their attention focus upon him. This time it was harder to pass. After casting the Patronus, an act of the purest light magic, his aura had changed. To the Dementors, he now smelled, not only of darkness and death, but also of something unbearably bright that clung to him like the scent of perfume on clothes. This light irritated them, beckoned them, and yet repelled them. "Open up," Snape ordered hoarsely, without stopping. The iron gates screeched, sliding open reluctantly. The Dementor, hanging lowest, glided close to his face. Snape smelled the rot, heard the rattling breath of the abyss. Memories he had hidden so diligently stirred in his head. Lily's scream, Voldemort's laughter, the sound of Dumbledore's body falling from the astronomy tower. But this time he had a new weapon. A fresh memory. The Silver Doe standing on the bank of the forest pool. Harry Potter, alive, with the sword in his hands. Snape did not summon a Patronus. He simply allowed this memory to flare up inside, creating an invisible mental shield. The Dementor recoiled, making a sound like hot stones hissed when thrown into water. Snape passed through the gates without looking back. The school grounds were covered in snow, pristine and untouched. Not a single footprint. This meant the Carrows had not come out to patrol the exterior, preferring to terrorize students in the warm corridors. Approaching the oak front doors, Severus paused. He looked at the windows of the great hall. Inside, breakfast would soon begin. Hundreds of children, frightened, sleepy, would come to eat their porridge. Under the supervision of Death Eaters, they would whisper, cast hateful glances at him, and dream of Harry Potter coming to save them. "He will come," thought Snape, touching the cold handle of the door. "But not today, and not as quickly as you wish." He entered the castle. The entrance hall met him with silence, broken only by the distant humming of magical torches. The warmth of the room hit his face, causing a tingling in his frozen cheeks. Snape removed the disillusionment charms from his clothes. Now, he was once again the headmaster in black, not a shadow of the forest. He headed towards the stairs leading to the dungeons, but then remembered his place was now in the tower. The habit of living for years in the dark of the dungeons died hard. He turned and walked to the main marble staircase. On the first floor, he met nearly headless Nick. The Gryffindor ghost was floating sadly down the corridor, examining the frost patterns on the windows. Seeing Snape, Nick froze and attempted to become more transparent, to merge with the wall. Fear. Even the ghosts feared him. "Sir Nicholas?" nodded Snape as he passed. His voice was dry, official. "Headmaster," the ghost replied barely audibly, clutching his hand to his partially severed neck. This brief meeting stung Severus painfully for some reason. Once, a very long time ago, when he was a first year, Nick had welcomed him to the school, making no distinction between him and the others. Now he was, to the ghost, the embodiment of the evil that had seized their home. "Let it be so," Snape told himself. "Let them fear. Fear keeps them sharp. Fear forces them to be cautious." He ascended to the 7th floor. The stone gargoyle guarding the entrance to the office sat in its place, frowning and sleepy. "Dumbledore," said Snape, giving the password. He had not changed the password. It was his small, unnoticed tribute, or perhaps stubbornness. The Carrows thought it was simply the name of the former headmaster, used by Snape as a mockery. They did not understand that for Snape, this name was an anchor. The gargoyle hopped aside, revealing the spiral staircase. Snape stepped onto the moving stairs, and they carried him smoothly upwards, to the heart of the castle, to the only place where he could finally remove the mask that had grown to his face. The headmaster's office was bathed in soft, golden light. A special atmosphere always reigned here, one that could not be destroyed even by the presence of dark artifacts Snape was forced to display on the tables for show before Voldemort. But the true soul of the office remained unchanged. It was the smell of old books, the quiet whirring of silver instruments, and the sensation of wisdom accumulated over centuries. As soon as the door closed behind him, cutting him off from the rest of the castle, Severus allowed himself to exhale. The sound escaped his chest like a groan. He walked to the chair and literally collapsed into it, not removing his cloak. His hands were trembling. Now that the danger had passed, the adrenaline crash washed over him completely. On the desk, where he had left them, lay the tales of Beedle the Bard. The fake sword lay in the niche, its counterfeit rubies glinting. Everything was as it had been a few hours ago, but the world had changed. "Severus," Albus Dumbledore's voice sounded quiet, solicitous. Snape raised his head. The portrait was not asleep. Dumbledore sat in his painted armchair, leaning forward, his blue eyes carefully studying Snape's pale, exhausted face. "It is done," said Snape. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken for weeks. "Potter has the sword." Dumbledore exhaled slowly, leaning back. An expression of deep relief appeared on his face. "And he accepted it?" "Accepted." Snape smiled crookedly. "He dived for it into a hole in the ice. Like a true Gryffindor, he decided the hardest way was the only right one. He nearly drowned." "Nearly?" Dumbledore's eyebrows rose. "Weasley returned," Snape said briefly. "He pulled him out." Dumbledore closed his eyes, and a tear rolled down his painted cheek. "Ronald Weasley. I hoped, I knew his heart would lead him back. The Deluminator worked." "The Horcrux is destroyed," continued Snape, wishing to finish the official report. "I saw it." The locket crumbled to dust. He fell silent. A silence fell over the office, broken only by the clicking of the strange silver instruments. "Did you see them, Severus?" asked Dumbledore after a minute. "Did you see Harry? How does he look?" Snape stood up and walked to the drinks cabinet. He needed something strong. He poured himself a glass of fire whiskey, not offering any to the portrait, an old joke that now seemed inappropriate. "He looks like a cornered beast," said Snape, staring at the amber liquid. "Exhausted, filthy, angry." He took a sip, feeling the warmth spread down his throat. "But he is alive, and he has the sword, and his friends are with him again. Thanks to you," Dumbledore reminded him softly. Snape set the glass down sharply on the table. "Don't!" he hissed. "Do not make me a hero, Albus. I did not save them for their sake. I followed your orders. I kept my promise." "The promise you made to Lily," the portrait said quietly. Snape froze. The name, spoken aloud, hung in the air once more. "The Doe, Severus," continued Dumbledore. "Your Patronus. You summoned her, didn't you? She led him to the sword." Snape turned to the window. The sun had already risen over the forbidden forest, painting the snow in pink and gold tones. A beautiful, cold morning. "Yes," he replied barely audibly. "She led him, and he followed her. He trusted her. He did not know who sent her. If he had known—" "It does not matter," interrupted Dumbledore. "Soul magic does not lie. He felt the light, Severus. Your light, you may hide it under black robes, under a mask of cruelty, under layers of sarcasm, but tonight, in the darkest forest, it was your light that saved the hope of this world." Snape was silent. His shoulders slumped. He felt empty, burned out. The Patronus had taken so much strength, so much emotion from him, that now it seemed he would never feel anything again. But it was not so. Somewhere deep down, beneath the ash of fatigue, glowed a small, warm sensation, a sense of rightness. He remembered Harry's eyes as he looked at the Doe. There was wonder and awe in them. The boy had looked at Snape's magic as if it were a miracle. Perhaps it was the only moment in all these years when there was no hatred between them, only pure magic and a common goal. "You need to rest," Dumbledore's voice brought him back to reality. "The Carrows will wake soon. You will need strength to play your role again." "Role?" Snape smiled bitterly. "Sometimes it seems to me, Albus, that the role has become my essence. That there is no mask anymore, that there is only darkness, and I have dissolved in it. He who can summon a Silver Doe will never dissolve in darkness completely," said Dumbledore firmly. "Remember that, Severus. When it is particularly hard, remember the Doe." Snape nodded. He downed the whiskey in one gulp and replaced the glass. He walked to the mirror, hanging by the door. From it, a pale man with sunken eyes and long black hair falling over his face looked back at him. The look of a murderer, the look of a traitor. He slowly fastened the buttons of his robes right up to the throat, straightened his back, arranged his face into an expression of cold arrogance and disdain. The occlumency barrier slid into place with a mental click. Emotions were hidden. Fatigue was driven into the farthest corner of consciousness. Severus Snape, headmaster of Hogwarts, servant of the Dark Lord, was ready for a new day. When Snape left the office, the castle had already woken. Sounds of life filled the corridors, the thumping of feet, distant voices, the slamming of doors. But this year, these sounds were different. There was no joy in them. It was the sound of survival, the sound of caution. He descended towards the great hall. A group of Ravenclaws came towards him. Seeing him, they fell silent instantly, pressed themselves against the wall, casting their eyes to the floor. They were afraid to breathe in his presence. Snape swept past, his robes billowing. He did not look at them, but he saw everything. He saw the bruises on one girl's wrist, the marks of Amicus's disciplinary shackles. He saw the fatigue in their eyes. Wait a little longer. He addressed them in his mind. Just survive. I cannot take away your pain, but I can ensure it does not become fatal. He entered the great hall. The Carrows were already sitting at the staff table. Amicus was eating bacon loudly, smacking his lips. Alecto was picking at her eggs with her fork, looking like a bored executioner. "Oh, Severus!" exclaimed Amicus, as Snape took his seat in the gold chair at the center. "We thought you weren't coming. Slept like the dead?" "I was working, Amicus," Snape replied coldly, pouring himself black coffee. "A concept with which you are evidently unfamiliar, judging by the fact that your reports on student progress are written at the level of a troll." Amicus reddened but remained silent. It was better not to argue with Snape. Especially in the morning, Severus swept his gaze over the hall. 4 long tables, Slytherin. Quiet, wary. Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff, frightened. And Gryffindor. His gaze stopped at the Gryffindor table. Ginny Weasley sat there. She looked pale, but her eyes burned with a stubborn fire. Beside her was Neville Longbottom, new scratches visible on his face. They were whispering. Snape felt the Carrows tense beside him, also noticing this whispering. "What are they plotting over there?" hissed Alecto. "Need to punish them. As a preventative measure." "Leave them," said Snape calmly, not looking up from his coffee. "What?" Alecto turned her head to him. "I said, leave them. Longbottom is serving detention with Hagrid in the forest today. If you cripple him now, he won't be able to work. And we need a stock of moss for potions." It was a lie. Hagrid had no detentions today, but Snape knew Alecto was too lazy to check. "Well, all right," she grunted. "But tomorrow." Snape stopped listening to her. He looked at Neville, the boy he had terrorized for years. The boy who could have been the chosen one instead of Harry. Now this boy led the resistance within the school. "You have no idea," thought Snape, watching them. "You think you are alone. That the whole world is against you. That your headmaster is a traitor and a murderer." He took a sip of coffee. It was bitter, like his whole life. "But tonight I gave your hope a sword. I gave your hero a chance. And as long as I sit in this chair, as long as I wear this mask, I will stand between you and total darkness. Even if you spit in my wake." The sun finally broke through the clouds, flooding the hall with bright light. Rays fell through the stained glass, painting the stone floor with multicolored patches. Snape felt a strange calm. The doe was gone. The magic had dissipated. The sword was far away. But something had changed. The burden of silence had become a little lighter. Because now it was not just the silence of cowardice or betrayal. It was the price he paid consciously. He remembered the Forest of Dean, the silence, the white snow, and the silver light leading through the gloom. "To work," he said sharply, rising from the table. His black robes swirled like the wings of a raven. He walked towards the exit, and the students parted before him, lowering their heads. They saw the terror of the dungeons. They saw Dumbledore's murderer. They did not see that on the hem of his black robes, where the fabric touched the floor, there still remained tiny invisible droplets of water from a forest pool. Water of hope. He walked on into the darkness of the corridors, bearing his cross and his secret. His watch continued. His war was not yet over. And somewhere out there, far to the south, 3 teenagers were taking the next step towards the victory he had prepared for them. Always,